Welcome back to the Chats and Recaps podcast with your host, Sammy.
And Mimi. We're glad you joined us today. So let's get into it.
Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.
And don't forget to hit that notification bell so that you never miss an upload.
These are true stories from the HBO docu-series I'll Be Gone in the Dark. The following episode may contain graphic depictions of rape, violence, and sexual assault, which may not be suitable for all listeners. Listening discretion is advised.
If you or anyone you know is a victim of rape, sexual assault, or abuse, please reach out to your local police department or a crisis hotline for support.
Happy Wednesday! It's a gloomy day here in Florida while we're recording this podcast, but we're coming back to go over episode 2 and 3 of I'll Be Gone in the Dark. So thank you for joining us again.
Welcome.
Let's get into it.
Alrighty. So we are compressing both episodes into this podcast. So we're going to do episode 2 and 3. I just want to share one thing that Michelle was a fan of Agatha Christie, and I just have to share that because I'm a fan of Agatha Christie. I grew up reading her books, and I'll still continue to read any books, and I'll read them over and over. Her books are really good. She is a fantasy crime writer, and her detective is Detective Poirot, who she wrote about a lot in all her books. So I just wanted to share that we had that one thing in common besides being fascinated about researching things to try to help solve
Cold cases.
Yeah.
So episode 2 started with a victim describing the night that the man came to her home. She was under hypnosis and was kind of just going through and describing everything thoroughly, which hypnosis is something that they do a lot on victims or necessarily anyone who might have information about a case, but it can't be pulled directly from your memory recall. So they do hypnosis to pull those things out of you. I know in a lot of cases like these, people tend to block it out and hide it deep somewhere in their brain to protect themselves. So that was interesting that they started the episode with that. And episode 2, I feel like majority of the episode was all focused around the root issue regarding the culture during that time period, that every effort was made to put blame on the victim rather than the assaulter or the rapist.
You know, I feel blessed that I was a woman from the 80s to the 90s, the late 80s to the 90s, and not a woman in the 60s or 70s. Because when I was looking at this episode, and it just reminded me of how far women have come. I know it's still out there, but we have come a long way. How victims are treated today as they were yesterday. Yesterday, if you didn't say no to your rapist, then you consented. Today, if you're saying no, no means no. Back then, if you didn't say no more than once, then you consented, because like a guy would say, oh, she said no, but her body was saying yes. No is no. So the episode 2 really did state how when the police came in to the crime scene, how they treated the victim, how they made the victim feel guilty. They made the victim feel like it was their fault that it happened. And, you know, it's just like, well, how was you dressed?
Mm-hmm.
What were you next to your window? Did you undress next to your window?
Yeah.
Like, did you provoke anything that would have caused that person to come in and rape you?
Yeah.
Like, are you kidding me? My stomach just turned.
I know. That was a big focal point of the episode. And it's something I feel like is still important to this day, because even though you did say we have come a long way, there's still a long way for us to continue going and continue advancing. They went into how it was like a numbers game for him. From what they had, at that point, it had been like 50 rapes. And those are just the ones reported. Obviously, we're just talking about the culture at that time. Those are the women who came out. We don't know if there were other victims that were unreported or things like that. And I was just like, it's so insane how he could get away with so many and yet not quite enough information to identify or find him.
Mm-hmm.
They then go in to talk about different rapist cases who were also very active in that time period, who raped many women with no consequences.
Mm-hmm.
They were not getting caught, and they were definitely not receiving proper punishments when they were caught. They were certainly not giving those cases media attention.
No.
And when the woman was talking about how a lot of those who actually were caught were treated, she stated that a lot of them were treated as minor assaults, which I feel like is absolutely disgusting.
Mm-hmm.
It was really showing how women have always been somehow put at fault and looked at like they did something wrong. We're still fighting these stigmas today. And they went into another portion where they were kind of showing, I guess, video footage that they showed at the time to women, and they showed everything that the woman did wrong to get raped.
Yeah.
They started with the woman made one bad move after another. It's disgusting and foul. I can't even imagine how that made victims feel to watch that as women in that time period. I can't fathom it. This mindset still very much exists today. The fight to stop excusing that the victim draws these things to them instead of faulting the rapists and criminals appropriately. Notice how every story they paint the victim as basically, quote, not paying enough attention. It's always somehow how the victim attracts these things.
How it was their fault.
Exactly. In the video that they showed of the woman, they were like, she made one bad move after another. First of all, she was by herself. In that time period, they acted like, oh, it's because you didn't have a man next to you. You didn't have a man with you. You didn't have any protection. You didn't have like a dog or this and that and the other. They show a woman walking down the street at night. So apparently her first mistake was that because she's a woman, apparently she's not allowed to walk the streets at night. I mean, God forbid she stops and looks into a shop window. Then they said, boom, that's mistake number 2, how she was looking in the shop window. Now it's down to, oh, how was she walking? Maybe she was walking suggestively. She was wearing a dress and like exposing her shoulders or her knees or whatever. So obviously, she's pretty much asking for it. And then they're just like pointing out, oh, she made this mistake, this mistake, this mistake, this mistake. So her getting raped pretty much was her fault, which was awful.
That's true. They were like, well, how were you walking? What were you doing out there at that time of night?
Yep.
You should have been home. If you're going to walk at that time of night, why weren't you walking with someone like a man? But that's the thing. When the media started saying, oh, the rapist is only raping women that are by themselves. Obviously they're targeting either women that are not married, single, or alone. So then he upped his game. He said, oh, okay, so you think it's because I'm afraid that a man is in the house?
He saw it as a challenge.
So let me go ahead and start raping women where their husband is home and see where it goes. It's just sick to think that when one of the victims were explaining when they came out to the house, her husband was home. He made her tie up her husband. And then he tied her up, and then he abused her. And then the husband couldn't do anything. When she finally got out and ran to her next door neighbor then got a gun, and he told her to stay there and went to her house, and I guess untied her husband and helped. They called the police. The police came. When the police were interviewing him, I got so disgusted at what he said. It's like, oh, well, when I saw, it's not every day you see a pretty naked woman running out on the street in the middle of the night.
Yeah, the guy said, quote, not every day you see a pretty naked woman running across your front lawn at 2 a.m.
Yes.
Considering the circumstances, like she was obviously running for her life in fear. And the fact that he said he didn't think anything of that, like, I'm sorry, what? How do you see someone running across the lawn screaming and then a guy chasing her on a bike and you don't think anything of it? This is into the next episode, by the way. This is in episode 3 where they talk about this. They also go over the Santa Barbara area where he was prowling. The sheriff who was in the past episode, what was his name?
Oh, in the
He's heavily
past
involved in the whole story.
or the present?
He was talking about how he reached out to Santa Barbara because he saw about the murders that happened, the Santa Barbara murders related
Yes.
to EAR-ONS. When he reached out to Santa Barbara police station, they denied that any murders actually happened.
Yes.
And then secondly, he reached out again and he was able to actually get information about the 2 murders that occurred.
Then Manuela's husband, apparently he never married after his wife was killed, because he was in the hospital with some kind of infection or something, or some kind of virus. So he was being treated for that. And then to think that the police were kind of accusing him of killing his wife. So he never married. He was self-medicated. He was pretty much torturing himself because of everything that happened. And another thing I commend Michelle on, she did a lot of investigating, something that I don't know why they didn't think of doing, but she started researching all of the jewelry that were stolen from the serial killer, from the victims. So one in particular was some cufflinks that had the initials NR. So she started looking at eBay and she started, doing all these little researches, and lo and behold, she did find a pair of cufflinks that looked just like the ones that were stolen from the victim. It ended up not being the victim's cufflink, but it also brought in a detective by the name of Paul Hope, who was in the 2000 while she was doing this book, who he read an article on, and he was fascinated by her article. And when he spoke to her, she did another article, and he thought, well, I don't know if I can trust her. But when she left a lot of stuff out of the article, he felt, okay, I can trust her. I can open up to her. So they started sharing a lot of the things. And then another thing, with all the DNA that they collected from the victims back then, they were able to do DNA testing today, which at the time they were saying all these killings were from different people, because every time they went to the crime scene, there was always something a little different. So they were like, oh, it's just different men that are doing this, or different people that are doing this. And but DNA actually matched all victims together, bringing all these cases to that one person.
It's funny that they said that all the things had something a little bit different, but yet every single case had the same MO pretty much. He did everything like pretty much identical.
And then to think, for so many years, that whole state, for so many years, women, people, everyone had to live in fear, never knowing when the killer would strike next and who was going to be their next victim. I mean, and it was even eerie to listen to the recorded tapes of the phone being tapped on these victims, where they would get these phone calls and no one would answer. And then there would be heavy breathing. And then he would say, I'm going to kill you, bitch. So I'm like, whew. It was just eerie. So imagine her listening to this, constantly listening to these tapes, to the victims. She had the tapes. She had the cases. It was like she was there watching the whole thing happen. I don't know how one person can take all that. I don't know. Because we're just getting clips. We're just getting clips here and there.
Yeah.
And it's disturbing to us. So I could just imagine her, what she went through. It's insane. It's insane.
This is also the time where they start going into Michelle McNamara writing her book. She first started by meeting with a woman who was introduced in the previous episode, who was writing for a magazine. She got a lot of attention for the article In the Footsteps of a Killer, which is when people really she started to get a lot of attention for her writing. That's what made her so successful. She was then invited to New York to turn her research into a book. Something Michelle did, which is so important, and what made her stories impact and reach as far as they did, is because she was humanizing the victims.
Yes.
And when you humanize someone, it allows people to put themselves into the shoes of a victim. So my question was, why were they so easily able to humanize killers, and yet when it came to telling the stories of the victims, they were not able to do so? But Michelle doing this allows people to feel true empathy and desire to bring justice for these victims. You can't want to help someone or care if you don't feel a connection to them. It's like watching a TV show. You don't care about characters unless the show does a good job of painting the image of that character in the show for you to relate and care about them as fellow human beings, which is like, it's kind of sad to say, but is something obviously that she was very good at and that was needed to be done at that time. So I can imagine for any empathetic human the toll that it would take on you to constantly engulf yourself into these stories, especially with the way she was able to place herself into the victim's shoes. It's almost like method acting, when they literally put themselves in the mindset of that person. That's something that she did, but she wouldn't have been able to do such a great job of humanizing them and portraying their stories without having true and deep empathy. And so it definitely takes a toll on the human psyche, and they start to kind of go a little bit deeper into the toll it took on her. At the same time, they start going back into the case of the EAR-ONS killer. He was starting to get more and more aggressive in his attacks, and also more confident with every successful attack that he did.
Yes, he did.
They go over a case with a couple, and I didn't get the names. I don't know if you got the names down. It was Patricia, and I can't remember the husband's name. It was Patricia and something, who were both murdered.
So the first couple he killed, it was Patricia. They called her Patty. It was Patty and her husband. And the scary thing was, he brutally beat them after raping Patty.
Yes.
And killed them while their children were in the other rooms. Okay. In the morning, the alarm was sounding off, and their oldest son was like, why is the alarm sounding off? And they're not turning it off. It's unusual because as soon as the alarm sounds off, they always, sounds off, they turn it off. So when he went into the room, he went and he turned off, and he saw that they were not moving. So he was like, let me step out of the room because they're still sleeping. I guess they're tired. Then he noticed they just weren't moving. And then on the other side of the sheet, he saw like a stain. And that's when he found that they were dead. They were brutally beaten. So that was the first couple. Then the second one was Sharon and her boyfriend, Greg. They were found killed by their realtor, who said they were so brutally beaten. They did find DNA on all of these victims of his semen on the comforters. And now the thing with Greg was he actually killed him, but he didn't rape Sharon. They found semen, but he didn't rape her. Or am I getting it confused with another one? Because there was one that he didn't get to rape because the boyfriend or the husband went to attack him.
Right.
So he ended up killing the guy, and he, I guess, got so mad that she was the worst brutally beaten person killed because I guess her husband or her boyfriend attacked him. It was horrible. And not only it taking the toll, reading all these investigations, looking at photos, putting yourself in the victim's shoes, I can definitely understand why her husband Patan was constantly saying how she would get up in the middle of the night and she's trying to escape her room, or she's trying to run out of the house, or she starts throwing things thinking that she's fighting some attacker. And I can see why she started taking medications. She couldn't sleep. She couldn't sleep. It took a toll on her.
Yeah, definitely. She was also writing her book at the time, which was something that ended up turning into from what it's portrayed, that it turned into a very stressful situation with her. She was someone who was more comfortable discussing others, not herself. She didn't like the fact that part of her book deal required sharing parts of her own life. However, the next part they dig into is her past and growing up. She was the youngest with a very large age gap between her older siblings. She was strong-willed from the beginning. She found her voice very early on. Michelle viewed her mother as a quote-unquote enemy. She was the youngest and she wanted more physical attention, but her mother was extremely reserved. So her mother had a hard time showing affection. She did depict her relationship with her mother as a tough one, with difficulty communicating in a positive way. She was severely asking her mother to show affection and that she cared, and she was doing things to make her feel worried just because it kind of fed that need for attention. I'm sure there are many people out there that can relate to her story with the relationship she shared with her mother. I personally can't, obviously, because we have a very close connection. And then after this, they go back into another couple that was murdered in the middle of the night, which you talked about. Greg Sanchez, the murderer, when he was attacked by the man, and was his most brutal thus far, including that he actually sustained injuries himself.
Yes, he did.
Then she goes back into the relationship with her mother, that the biggest blowout that she had, which was at her wedding. Her mother made a comment stating that regarding her being a writer, quote, that quote, isn't it too late for her? So this obviously really hurt her, broke her down. And then we go on to discussion on politics in Hollywood and how politics and Hollywood, and even apparently in this time period, realtors and their real estate, I don't know how to say that, real estate business.
It was the real estate board.
Yeah, the real estate board, how they weren't wanting bad press because they live in those areas of town. And so they had made
tough to sell.
Yeah,
homes.
they made agreements not to
With the
publicize
sheriff.
crimes. They do talk about the Ronald Reagan area. He was running for president, and he also didn't want the bad press getting out in his neighborhood and everything like that. So these were all things that were shutting down these stories being aired and shared with the community. And not publicizing crimes does not mean they didn't happen.
Exactly.
So I think it's just crazy that they looked at these things and only thought of, oh, the bad publicity, instead of needing to bring justice to these victims.
Yeah, that's
So
true.
we keep seeing this throughout the docu-series, and it really disturbs and frustrates me every single time I hear it. See, I'm so frustrated I can't even talk right.
No, I mean, looking at the docu-series, I put myself in these victims' shoes at that time. I don't know how I would have handled myself. Like, I probably would have grabbed one of those cops, because they were constantly saying stuff like, well, at least they got the pretty one this time, or or they would interrogate the victim like they were the suspect.
Yep.
They even went through polygraphy test. Polygraph test. They went through interrogations over and over and over. They were sent to psychiatrists to make sure they're not crazy. I mean, this is insane what these victims went through when they spoke.
I know.
Which is why I can see why a lot of people did it. Because they saw what that girl went through. I'm not going to go through what she went through. Look what they did to her. And she was a high society person. So can you imagine someone like me, who, you know, parties or whatever? I don't care what you do. No woman deserves to be raped. I don't care if you're walking down the street naked. No woman deserves to be raped.
Exactly. They also go back into showing Michelle throughout her process of writing the book. At this point, it's clear that she's becoming increasingly paranoid, like you stated, with her having the nightmares, constantly being worried about doors being locked in the house and things like that. And she installed a very high security security system in the home. They also go into how her father passed. They do, from what we briefly see of him, he was obviously very invested in what she was doing. He was always keeping up to date and very supportive of her. Then we go back into the stories a little bit more. And this is a part that really frustrated me when it was brought up, when he was talking about going back into these cases. Part of the reason people weren't wanting to go back into them is because of the statute of limitations. So statute of limitations is mentioned at the end of the episode as a reason for not being able to charge and take action on the rapist and serial killer. So I had to look up statute of limitations because I know what it is a little bit, but I want to give a formal definition. So statute of limitations is a law that forbids prosecutors from charging someone with a crime that was committed more than a specific number of years ago. The main purpose of these laws is to ensure that convictions are based upon evidence, physical or eyewitness, that has not deteriorated with time. After the time period has run, the crime can no longer be prosecuted, meaning that the accused person is essentially free. Each state establishes its own statutes of limitations, often with different time limits for distinct types of crime. Not all crimes are governed by statute of limitations. Murder, for example, has none, meaning that a murderer can be brought to justice even many decades later. Some states also have no time limits for certain other types of crime, such as sex offenses or terrorism charges.
Or murder.
Colorado has no statute of limitations on treason. California has none on embezzlement of public funds. Some states classify their crimes in categories for these purposes. In Indiana, for example, level 3 felonies have a 5-year statute of limitations. This makes it necessary to look up which crimes are considered level 3. So I went to this website. It's called criminal.findlaw.com. That's where I got the definition. It was the one I found that was most in-depth. I mean, I did look on quite a few sites, but this is the one that really went into the most depth. And I'm not going to go down every single state, but I just want to show you an example of how we still need to grow, because to me, there should be no statute of limitation on sexual assault or sexual offenses. And yet it's disgusting to me to go down the list and see how many states do not classify sex offenses as being exempt from statute of limitations. Here's one example. Alabama, violent felonies, arson, forgery, counterfeiting, any sex offense with someone under 16, drug trafficking have no statute of limitations, meaning at any time they can always go back and prosecute. Notice that this only count sex offenses if you're under 16. Insinuating, though, as if you're 16 or older, somehow
there's a statute.
There's nothing to protect you after a certain amount of time. Alaska is murder, kidnapping, numerous sex crimes have no statute of limitations. However, it's only numerous sex crimes, not all of them. Let's see, here's another one. There was one I found where they only have a statute of limitations if for a sex offense if it's against a child, which is Colorado. No statute of limitations, only if it's a child. So as you can see, I mean, that's just a couple of states. I haven't even gone down the full list, and there's 50 states in the United States. To me, the rules on statute of limitations, including murder and other things that should have no limitations on when you can convict someone, should not be a state-by-state decision. It should be a federal law over all states. It's crazy that somebody in like Florida versus somebody in Utah are not protected the same. And if you go on vacation somewhere else and God forbid something happens to you, now you are subject to whatever that state law deems as how to protect you, is really sad. And it shows that we still, again, have a long ways to go.
That is true.
So I just thought that was interesting. I wanted to share it.
Well, a lot of those laws were written a long time ago, and a lot of them have not been updated.
And I want to share, because if you are in any of these states where the statute of limitations is not covering things like sex offenses, that it's important to be involved in your state. It's important to speak up. It's important to reach out to your legislatures and your local lawmakers to make change.
Yep.
Because change clearly still needs to happen in many areas, and this is another one of them.
Yeah, and until something major doesn't happen, people don't start making movement on these laws to be changed. They need to be updated. I don't think there should be any kind of statute of limitation once a crime has been committed. It's a crime. There's no statute of limitations if you were caught with drugs and you run. There's no statute of limitations.
Let me see. Yeah, for Alabama, drug trafficking is none, but there are some states that don't have that do have a statute of limitations on like drug trafficking and things like that. It depends on the level of offense, because it's like if you had like a small amount of marijuana or something on you, and even though I know that that's pretty much getting rid of in most states anyway.
Yeah, that took a long time for them to pass that, because there were people sitting in jail longer than some guy raping a woman.
Yeah, it's like, how is that more worthy of being in prison than somebody who literally raped another person?
I have no idea.
Who walk free, who get slaps on the wrist. It's like, we need to get our priorities straight here.
You're found with drugs, you're going to jail for a long time. You rape someone, hey, you might do 6 months, maybe even 90 days, or maybe just walk. Did she say no?
Crazy.
No, she never said no. Then that wasn't rape. That's how it was. And today, people that are caught with drugs face more jail time than people who commit crimes on children, women, and men.
Yep. So a lot of change still needs to be made. I just thought because we're covering this topic in the episode that it was important to discuss that as well, because of things that still impact our day-to-day life, maybe that you might not be aware of, but now you can educate yourself. And at the end of the episode, it really shows how the case is just breaking her down mentally. And I think the episode ended with her talking about having a mental breakdown because of everything going on and with her book, and her husband really encouraging her like, hey, you can do this. And then that was the end of the episode. So we'll catch up again on episode 4 and we'll continue following the story and we'll recap that episode. We probably won't do a 2-in-1 recap. We wanted to do the 2-in-1 episode recap this week so that we could catch up on it because we started a week late. So next week it will likely be just 1 episode recap. Unless you like us doing the 2-in-1, then we can do another 2-in-1 for you if you prefer the condensed version. Of course, you can leave us a comment, send us a message, let us know. We love to hear from you. If you have anything that you want to say that you would like us to bring up in our next episode, please do so. We'd be happy to hear from you. This Friday, we're going to be posting an episode on Jeffrey Epstein. We're going to look at his series and do a recap on that this Friday, like I mentioned last week. And then next week, The Bachelor is coming back again, greatest seasons ever. So we're going to be having a little bit more lighthearted content on Wednesday of next week when we recap that episode. And then next week, Friday, we're going to get back into the HBO docu-series, I'll Be Gone in the Dark.